They said the uniform would make him an American hero. They said that by fighting for freedom overseas, he had earned his place at the table of a grateful nation. They pinned a medal to his chest, shook his hand, and called him a patriot. For 3 long years, Sergeant Isaac Woodard had served his country in the sweltering jungles of the Pacific, fighting an enemy that wanted to kill him. He had survived the war. He had earned his honorable discharge. And in February of 1946, he was finally on a bus, heading home. But in the Jim Crow South, that blue uniform with its gleaming eagle buttons was not a shield. It was a target. And the war he had just survived was nothing compared to the one he was about to face. This is the story not just of a soldier who was brutalized, but of a moment so horrifying, so undeniably evil, that it forced a sitting president to look into the dark heart of his own country and choose a side. To understand what happened on that bus, you must first understand the man. Isaac Woodard was not a political activist. He was not a troublemaker. He was a quiet, hard-working man from South Carolina who had answered his nation's call. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, he, like millions of other young men, enlisted. He was sent to the Pacific Theater, serving in a segregated labor battalion. It wasn't glorious work. He loaded ships, dug latrines, and hauled ammunition under the constant threat of enemy attack. He endured the heat, the jungle rot, and the daily humiliation of serving in a segregated army that saw him as fit to die for his country, but not fit to share a mess hall with a white soldier. He did his duty, earned the rank of sergeant, and was awarded a battle star for his service in the New Guinea campaign. He was, by every definition, a good soldier. And now, the war was over. In February 1946, he stood at his discharge processing center in Georgia, a free man. With 3 years of back pay in his pocket, a new suit of clothes, and his honorable discharge papers, he felt a sense of pride and relief that was intoxicating. He had done it. He had served, he had survived, and he was going home to his wife in North Carolina. He pinned his medals to his uniform, a visible symbol of his service, believing, perhaps naively, that the uniform made him an equal. He boarded a Greyhound bus, heading north, just one of millions of GIs making their way back to a life of peace. But the America he was traveling through was a nation holding 2 completely different conversations with itself. White America was celebrating the greatest generation. For white GIs, the return home meant ticker tape parades, the promise of the GI Bill, the keys to a new suburban house, and a nation ready to honor their sacrifice. But for the more than 1 million black soldiers returning from the war, the reality was starkly different. They had fought under the banner of the Double V campaign, victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. They had won the first victory, but the second one seemed further away than ever. They returned not to parades, but to the same back doors, the same colored-only waiting rooms, the same systemic oppression they had left behind. And there was something new in the air, something dangerous. The sight of a black man in a military uniform, a man who had been trained to fight, a man who carried himself with the confidence of a soldier, was seen by many in the white South not as a hero, but as a threat, a dangerous idea walking. In the months after the war, a wave of horrific violence was unleashed against black veterans across the South. Men were lynched for the crime of wearing their uniform in public. They were beaten for trying to register to vote. They were murdered for refusing to show the proper deference to a white person. Isaac Woodard, sitting on that bus as it rumbled through the night, was a symbol of everything the Jim Crow South feared and hated. He had survived the Japanese army, but could he survive the bus ride home through South Carolina? The journey was long. Hours ticked by. The initial elation of heading home began to mix with the weary fatigue of travel. Sometime after the bus crossed into South Carolina, not far from his own home state, Woodard asked the bus driver a simple, human question. At the next scheduled stop, could he please be allowed to step off and use the restroom? It was a simple, human need, a request that any man, anywhere, should be able to make. The driver cursed at him and told him to sit down. At the next town, a small, sleepy place called Batesburg, the driver stopped the bus, not at the rest stop, but in front of the local police station. He got off and returned with the town's police chief, a man named Linwood Shull. Shull boarded the bus, demanded to know who had been causing trouble, and the driver pointed to the uniformed sergeant sitting quietly in his seat. Isaac Woodard, a decorated veteran of the United States Army, was ordered off the bus. He didn't know it yet, but he had taken his last steps as a man who could see the world. His war was not over. It had just begun. What happened next on that quiet street in Batesburg, South Carolina, would take only a few minutes, but its aftershocks would shake the foundations of the nation. As Sergeant Isaac Woodard stepped off the bus, he tried to explain himself to Police Chief Linwood Shull. He was a soldier, he said, just trying to get home. He showed his discharge papers. He was calm, respectful, believing that the uniform he wore and the papers he held still meant something. Did he really think the rules of a civilized world applied here? Did he believe that a piece of paper from the U.S. Army could protect him from the raw, irrational hatred of the Jim Crow South? Whatever hope he had was about to be extinguished. Shull wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in dominance. He saw a black man in a soldier's uniform, who had dared to speak up, who had not shown the proper silent deference. And that, in his world, was a crime that required immediate and brutal punishment. The two men exchanged words. Woodard, still a soldier at heart, may have refused to bow, refused to be cowed. Accounts differ on the exact words, but the result was the same. Shull began to strike Woodard with his blackjack, a small, leather-wrapped club weighted with lead. Woodard, defending himself, allegedly grabbed the club, and that was all the excuse Shull needed. He drew his nightstick, a long, heavy wooden baton, and what followed was not an arrest. It was an act of pure, unrestrained savagery. Shull beat Woodard relentlessly. He struck him again and again in the head and face. But it was what he did next that elevated this from a brutal beating into something uniquely monstrous. With the end of his nightstick, he jabbed it with full force into Isaac Woodard's eyes. First the left, then the right. He ground the wooden club into the soldier's eye sockets, deliberately, methodically, with the intention of destroying them. The sound of Woodard's screams was drowned out by the thud of the blows. He collapsed to the pavement, blinded, bleeding. His world suddenly plunged into an eternal, agonizing darkness. But the horror was not over. Shull, with the help of another officer, dragged the semi-conscious Woodard to the town's tiny, squalid jail. He was thrown into a cell without medical attention, left to lie in his own blood on a cold floor. He spent the night in unimaginable pain, his eyes swelling shut, his body a canvas of bruises. The next morning, still blind, he was taken before the local justice of the peace. He was charged with disorderly conduct and being drunk, despite the fact that he hadn't had a single drop of alcohol. Woodard tried to protest his innocence, but what could a blind black man say in a white Southern court? He was found guilty and fined $50, a fine he was forced to pay out of the back pay he had so proudly received just hours earlier. The system was not just brutal, it was mocking. It beat him, blinded him, and then made him pay for the privilege. For several days, Woodard languished in that jail cell, his condition worsening. The local authorities seemed content to let him rot. Was this their plan? To let this inconvenient problem, this evidence of their own barbarism, simply die in a dark corner where no one would ever know? It was only through the persistent inquiries of his family, who had reported him missing, that the Army authorities were finally alerted. They located him in that jail, a ghost of the proud soldier he had been just days before. He was finally transferred to a Veterans Administration hospital in Columbia, South Carolina. The doctors who examined him were horrified. The damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Both of his eyes had been ruptured beyond repair. The official medical diagnosis was stark and brutal: bilateral blindness caused by enucleation of both eyes. It was a cold, clinical term for an act of pure evil. They had been gouged out. Isaac Woodard, the man who had seen the world from the shores of the Pacific, would never see again. The darkness that had descended upon him on that street in Batesburg was permanent. He was 27 years old. For weeks, the story remained a local secret, a quiet horror known only to Woodard, his family, and a few military and VA officials. It could have ended there. Another forgotten tragedy, another number in the long, bloody history of racial violence in America. In a pre-civil rights era, without national media attention, this was the most likely outcome. An inconvenient story, buried and forgotten. But this story was different. This time, the silence would be broken. A local chapter of the NAACP got wind of what had happened. They saw the injustice, but they also saw something more. They saw a story so powerful, so undeniably evil, that it could not be ignored. A story of a returning hero, blinded for the crime of asking to use a bathroom while wearing the uniform of his country. They knew that if they could get this story out, if they could make America look at what had been done to this one man, they might just be able to force a change. The question was, who would listen? Who in a nation celebrating its great victory would be willing to turn their attention to this one inconvenient, blind soldier? They were about to find their answer in the most unexpected of places, on the national radio airwaves, from the mouth of one of the most famous men in America. The match had been struck. The nation was about to catch fire. The story of Isaac Woodard began its journey from a quiet hospital room to the national conscience through the tireless work of the NAACP. Walter White, the organization's executive secretary, was a man who understood the power of a narrative. When he heard the details of Woodard's case, he knew he was holding a weapon. This was not an ambiguous case of a street fight or a questionable arrest. This was a story of almost biblical injustice. A uniformed soldier, a hero returning from the war, blinded by a representative of the law for no crime at all. It was a story that cut through the noise, a perfect, horrifying symbol of the hypocrisy at the heart of America. White and his team began a meticulous campaign. They gathered affidavits, medical records, and Woodard's own heart-wrenching testimony. They began feeding the story to the black press, newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, which had long been the primary voice for chronicling the injustices faced by African Americans. These papers, read by millions in black communities across the country, seized on the story with a righteous fury. They printed Woodard's picture, the handsome young sergeant, his eyes now vacant, and contrasted it with images of him in his proud military portrait. The headlines were explosive, filled with outrage and demanding action. But Walter White knew that for the story to truly break through the wall of national indifference, it needed to cross over. It needed to be heard by white America. He began pitching it to the mainstream press, but the response was tepid. In 1946, the stories of Southern racial violence were often seen by national editors as regional problems, distasteful, but not necessarily front-page news. A few liberal magazines and newspapers picked it up, but it wasn't gaining the traction White knew it deserved. What he needed was a lightning rod, a voice so powerful and so respected that it could not be ignored. He found that voice in a man who was, at the time, one of the most famous and influential artists in the world, Orson Welles. Orson Welles, in 1946, was a cultural giant. His War of the Worlds radio broadcast had convinced a nation it was being invaded by Martians. His film, Citizen Kane, was already being hailed as one of the greatest movies ever made. He was a prodigy, a maverick, and he had a weekly national radio commentary show on ABC Radio. Wells was also a passionate, if sometimes erratic, progressive. When the NAACP brought the Woodard story to him, it touched a raw nerve. Wells was incensed. He saw in Woodard's blinding not just a crime, but a profound betrayal of everything America claimed to stand for. On the evening of July 28, 1946, Orson Welles went on the air, and for the next 15 minutes, he delivered one of the most blistering and emotional monologues in the history of American radio. He didn't just report the story, he inhabited it. He spoke directly to the still unknown police officer who had committed the crime. "We invite you to luxuriate in secrecy," Wells thundered, his famous baritone voice filled with a cold rage. "It will be a small room, officer, and you will be in it all alone. You're going to be sitting there for a long time. We are going to know you." He then spoke directly to his largely white audience, forcing them to confront the horror. "The blind soldier fought for me in this war," Wells declared. "The least I can do is fight for him. I have eyes. He hasn't. I have a voice. He hasn't. I am his brother." It was an electrifying moment. Millions of Americans, sitting in their living rooms, were suddenly confronted with a story they could not ignore, told by a voice they trusted. Wells didn't stop there. For 4 consecutive weeks, he dedicated his show to the Isaac Woodard case. He gave updates, read letters, and relentlessly hammered away at the injustice. He revealed the name of the town, Batesburg, and then the name of the police chief, Linwood Shull. He was, in effect, conducting a national manhunt on the public airwaves. He famously described the process of blinding Woodard in chilling detail, demanding that Shull be brought to justice. "Wash your hands, officer," Wells taunted him on the air. "Wash them well. You'll want to get all the blood off, and the thick darkness. Wash it off your hands." The effect was seismic. Wells's broadcasts turned a regional story into a national scandal. Letters poured into the ABC network, into the White House, and into the Department of Justice, demanding action. Mainstream newspapers, which had initially ignored the story, now had to cover it. The story of the blind soldier was everywhere. The pressure on the federal government became immense. This was no longer something they could sweep under the rug. The national spotlight, ignited by the NAACP and focused into a laser beam by Orson Welles, was now burning down on the small town of Batesburg, South Carolina, and on the office of the Attorney General in Washington, D.C. A trial was now inevitable. The only question was whether it would be a trial seeking justice or a trial designed to maintain the status quo. In the Jim Crow South, the answer to that question was never a foregone conclusion. But one thing was certain: the whole world was now watching. The national firestorm ignited by Orson Welles, and the NAACP forced the hand of the federal government. President Harry Truman's administration, deeply embarrassed by the international attention the case was receiving, could no longer afford to ignore it. The story of a decorated black soldier being blinded by a white police officer was a devastating blow to America's post-war image as a global leader of freedom and democracy. How could America condemn the atrocities of the Nazis while tolerating such barbarism at home? The hypocrisy was a glaring wound, and the Truman administration knew it needed to act. The Department of Justice was ordered to intervene. Federal prosecutors took over the case, a rare and significant move in an era when such crimes were almost always left to the jurisdiction of local, all-white Southern courts. Because the assault had happened while Woodard was a soldier in uniform, technically still under military jurisdiction until he reached home, the federal government could charge Police Chief Linwood Shull under a narrow federal statute for violating Isaac Woodard's civil rights. It was a flimsy legal basis, but it was the only tool they had. In the fall of 1946, a federal grand jury was convened, and to the shock of many in South Carolina, they returned an indictment. Linwood Shull would stand trial in a federal courtroom. For a moment, it seemed like a monumental step forward. A white Southern police chief was actually being held accountable for his violence against a black man. The NAACP hailed it as a landmark moment. Isaac Woodard, now a symbol of a movement, was cautiously optimistic. Perhaps, just perhaps, justice was possible. He traveled to the trial in Columbia, South Carolina, prepared to testify, to tell his story to a judge and jury. The trial, held on November 5th, 1946, became a national media event. Reporters from across the country descended on the city. The courtroom was packed, but any hope for a fair trial began to evaporate the moment the proceedings began. The courtroom was a perfect microcosm of the Jim Crow South. The judge, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and, most critically, every single member of the jury were white. Isaac Woodard was led to the witness stand, a man in perpetual darkness, guided by the hand of an aide. He told his story with a quiet, powerful dignity. He recounted the bus ride, the simple request to use the restroom, the confrontation, and the brutal, methodical blinding. His testimony was devastating, a first-hand account of the horror he had endured. The federal prosecutor, a man named Henry H. Edens, did his job. He presented the medical evidence, which was undeniable. He called witnesses, including the bus driver, though his testimony was evasive and self-serving. He tried to build a case that Shull had used excessive and illegal force, but he was fighting against an invisible, insurmountable wall, the unspoken code of Southern white supremacy. The defense attorney, on the other hand, didn't even bother with the pretense of a legal argument. His strategy was a blatant and ugly appeal to pure racism. He didn't try to deny that Shull had blinded Woodard. Instead, he sought to justify it. He portrayed Woodard as an uppity, aggressive black man who had forgotten his place. He painted Shull as a brave officer, simply doing his duty, putting a potential troublemaker in line. In his closing argument, he turned to the all-white jury and essentially asked them who they were going to believe: a decorated white police chief, one of their own, or this black man. He wasn't just defending his client. He was defending the entire racial hierarchy of the South. But the most shocking moments of the trial came from the judge himself. Judge J. Waddies Waring, a man from a prominent Charleston family, was expected to be a pillar of the Southern establishment. During the trial, he stunned the courtroom by openly siding with the defense. He belittled the federal government's case, expressed sympathy for Shull, and in his instructions to the jury, he all but told them to acquit. His bias was so flagrant, so completely unprofessional, that it was clear the verdict was a foregone conclusion. The jury went to deliberate. It took them less than 30 minutes. They returned to the courtroom, and the foreman delivered the verdict: not guilty. A wave of applause and cheers erupted from the white spectators in the courtroom. Linwood Shull, the man who had gouged out a soldier's eyes, was a free man. He walked out of the courtroom a local hero, vindicated by a system that saw his brutality not as a crime, but as a necessary act of racial enforcement. Isaac Woodard sat in silence, the cheers of the crowd washing over him in his darkness. The last, flickering ember of hope for justice had been extinguished. He had told his story, bared his soul and his pain, and the system had laughed in his face. The verdict was a brutal, final insult. It was a declaration that in the eyes of Southern justice, his life, his service, and his sight meant nothing. The not guilty verdict sent a shockwave of rage and despair through Black America. It was a slap in the face, a clear message that no matter what they did, no matter how bravely they served their country, they were still not considered fully human in the eyes of the law. Protests erupted in cities across the country. The NAACP organized rallies, but the legal battle was over. Linwood Shull would never face another day in court for what he had done. He would live out the rest of his life as a free man, dying in 1997 at the age of 95, never having publicly expressed a single word of remorse. The system had protected its own, but the story was not over. In fact, in a way that no one in that courtroom could have imagined, the most important part of the story was just beginning. The verdict that was meant to end the conversation had just guaranteed it would reach the highest office in the land. The acquittal of Linwood Shull was more than just a miscarriage of justice. It was a national disgrace, and the news of it landed on the desk of President Harry S. Truman with the force of a physical blow. To understand Truman's reaction, you have to understand the man. Truman was not a radical progressive. He was a product of his time and place, a man from Missouri whose own grandparents had been slave owners. His personal language and attitudes often reflected the casual racism of his era. By all accounts, he was a moderate, a pragmatist, not a crusader for civil rights. But Truman was also something else, a World War I veteran who had a deep, almost sacred respect for the uniform of the United States military. And he was a man with a fundamental, bedrock sense of fairness. The idea that a man who had served his country in war could be pulled off a bus, beaten, and blinded by a local cop, and that the legal system would then applaud the act, offended him to his core. The story of Isaac Woodard burrowed deep into Truman's conscience. It was the personal, human face of a problem he had, until then, only understood in abstract terms. He read the reports, saw the pictures, and was, by all accounts, genuinely horrified and enraged. This wasn't a statistic. This was a sergeant. This wasn't a political issue. It was a profound moral failing. He reportedly said to one of his aides in a moment of fury, "I had no idea it was as terrible as that. We've got to do something." This internal turmoil in the president's mind was being amplified by external pressure. Walter White and the NAACP, though devastated by the verdict, did not give up. They pivoted. The courts had failed, so they would take their case directly to the president. On September 19, 1946, a delegation of civil rights leaders, led by Walter White, secured a meeting with President Truman in the Oval Office. They came armed with a portfolio of horrors, a documented list of the lynchings and beatings that had plagued the South since the war's end. But the case they led with, the one they knew would hit the hardest, was the story of Isaac Woodard. They laid out the facts, the service, the blinding, the sham trial. Truman listened, his face reportedly growing grim. This was no longer a distant news story. It was a direct appeal for justice, being made in the most powerful office in the world. He was the commander-in-chief, and this was one of his soldiers. The delegation pressed him, asking him what he, as president, was going to do about a system that allowed such atrocities to go unpunished. According to those in the room, Truman was visibly moved and angered. Leaning forward on his desk, he looked at Walter White and said with a firmness that surprised them all, "My God, I had no idea it was as terrible as that. We've got to do something." For the civil rights leaders who had spent decades fighting a seemingly indifferent federal government, this was a watershed moment. They had finally found a president who was personally, morally outraged. But what could he do? The power of the presidency was limited. The southern states guarded their states' rights jealously, especially when it came to matters of race. Any direct federal intervention would be met with massive political resistance from the powerful bloc of Southern Democrats who controlled Congress and who were, ironically, essential to Truman's own party. A direct legislative assault on Jim Crow was, at the time, politically impossible. So Truman, the pragmatist, did what he could. He decided to use the power of the executive branch to bypass the congressional stalemate. On December 5, 1946, just 1 month after the acquittal of Linwood Shull, President Truman signed Executive Order 9808. This order created something unprecedented in American history: the President's Committee on Civil Rights. This was not just another bureaucratic commission. It was a high-profile body, stacked with 15 distinguished citizens, tasked with a clear and sweeping mandate to investigate the state of civil rights in the country and to recommend concrete actions for the federal government to take to secure those rights. It was a brilliant political move. It took the issue out of the hands of the hostile Southern-controlled congressional committees and placed it directly under the authority of the White House. The creation of this committee was a direct, traceable consequence of the Isaac Woodard case. The story of the blind soldier had been the catalyst, the final straw that had pushed a moderate president to take a radical step. The President's Committee on Civil Rights went to work with a sense of urgency. They held hearings, gathered testimony, and compiled data from across the country. They documented in excruciating detail the systemic reality of lynching, police brutality, voter disenfranchisement, and segregation. And at the heart of their investigation, the story that was told and retold as the prime example of the failure of the justice system was the story of Isaac Woodard. He was no longer just a victim. He was Exhibit A in the case against Jim Crow America. The darkness he had been plunged into was now illuminating the darkness of a nation. His personal tragedy was being transformed into a powerful tool for national change. The President's Committee on Civil Rights was not just an investigation, it was a national reckoning. For 10 months, this diverse group of leaders, academics, lawyers, labor organizers, and clergy conducted the most thorough and unflinching examination of racial injustice the country had ever seen. They traveled, they listened, and they documented a reality that much of white America had been able to comfortably ignore. They heard stories of lynchings that went unpunished, of black citizens denied the right to vote through intimidation and sham literacy tests, of children relegated to crumbling, underfunded schools. And they heard, again and again, the story of Isaac Woodard, which became a running theme, a brutal shorthand for the absolute failure of the system to protect its own. In October of 1947, the committee delivered its final report to President Truman. It was a document of explosive power, titled simply, "To Secure These Rights." It was not a cautious, bureaucratic paper. It was a moral manifesto. Spanning 178 pages, it was a damning indictment of racial segregation in America, calling it out as a systemic cancer that was corroding the nation's democratic ideals. It laid bare the hypocrisy of a country that had just fought a world war against tyranny while practicing its own form of tyranny at home. The report's recommendations were radical, even revolutionary, for their time. It called for a federal anti-lynching law, an end to poll taxes that prevented black citizens from voting, the creation of a permanent civil rights commission within the Department of Justice, and, most audaciously, the desegregation of the American military. This was the first time that a high-level, presidentially appointed body had ever officially recommended dismantling segregation in the armed forces. It was a direct assault on one of the most entrenched pillars of Jim Crow. The report made an explicit connection between the violence faced by veterans like Isaac Woodard and the necessity of desegregating the military. It argued that it was a profound moral and strategic failure for the nation to ask men to fight and die for their country in a segregated army, only to return home to be brutalized and denied their basic rights. The report stated, "We have a moral reason, an economic reason, and an international reason for believing that the time for action is now." The story of Isaac Woodard was the unspoken but ever-present moral reason. His tragedy had provided the emotional and ethical fuel for the committee's most daring recommendation. When the report was made public, it detonated a political bomb. The Southern Democrats, the so-called Dixiecrats, were apoplectic. They denounced the report as a treasonous assault on the Southern way of life and a violation of states' rights. They threatened to bolt from the Democratic Party, to sabotage Truman's legislative agenda, and to ensure his defeat in the upcoming 1948 presidential election. many of Truman's own advisors urged him to back away from the report, to shelve its recommendations, to choose political survival over moral conviction. It was, they argued, political suicide. Truman was now faced with the most difficult decision of his presidency. He was heading into a tough re-election campaign. He was being challenged from the left by Henry Wallace and from the right by Thomas Dewey. The last thing he needed was a full-blown rebellion from the powerful southern wing of his own party. The politically safe move was to do nothing, to let the report gather dust, to make a few speeches about equality, but avoid any concrete action. But the story of Isaac Woodard had done its work. It had lodged itself in Truman's conscience. He could not unknow what he now knew. He had looked into the abyss of American racism, and he was not willing to turn away. In a move of incredible political courage, Truman decided to double down. On February 2nd, 1948, he stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered the first ever presidential address dedicated entirely to civil rights. He called on Congress to enact the recommendations of his committee, including the anti-lynching laws and the abolition of the poll tax. He was drawing a line in the sand, daring his own party to defy him. Congress, controlled by the Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans, refused to act. They blocked every piece of civil rights legislation he proposed. The Dixiecrat Rebellion was in full swing, and it seemed as though Truman's gamble had failed. But Truman had one more card to play, a power that Congress could not block, the power of the Commander-in-Chief. On July 26, 1948, in the heat of his presidential campaign, Harry Truman did the unthinkable. He signed Executive Order 9981. The order's language was simple, direct, and world-changing. It declared, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." With the stroke of a pen, President Harry S. Truman had officially ordered the desegregation of the United States military. It was the most significant federal action on civil rights since the Emancipation Proclamation. The line is direct and unbroken. The blinding of a single soldier on a dark road in South Carolina led to the outrage of a president, which led to the formation of a committee, which led to a radical report, which led to an act of executive power that fundamentally reshaped one of America's most powerful institutions. Isaac Woodard, in his darkness, had forced the nation to see a truth it could no longer ignore. His personal sacrifice had been transmuted into a national catalyst, an involuntary martyrdom that had pushed a reluctant president to take his place in the history books as a civil rights pioneer. The system that had so casually and cruelly discarded him was now, because of him, being forced to change. While the political shockwaves from his case were reshaping the nation, Isaac Woodard himself was learning to navigate a world of perpetual darkness. The grand historical narrative often moves on after the pivotal event, but for the man at its center, the consequences were a daily, grinding reality. After the sham trial and the acquittal of his attacker, Woodard was left not with justice, but with the quiet, monumental task of rebuilding a life that had been shattered. He became a national figure, a symbol of racial injustice, but this fame brought little comfort and no financial security. The NAACP, recognizing its moral responsibility, sponsored a national fundraising tour for him. He traveled the country, speaking at rallies and church gatherings. A quiet, dignified man led to the podium to tell his horrific story. These events raised a significant amount of money, enough for his family to purchase a house in the Bronx, New York, and provide a degree of stability. But the fundraising also came at a cost. He had to relive the most traumatic moment of his life, over and over again, for audiences of strangers. He became, in a sense, a professional victim, his blindness the centerpiece of his public identity. And yet, by all accounts, he bore this burden with a quiet grace that was almost superhuman. He rarely, if ever, expressed public bitterness. His speeches were not calls for revenge, but pleas for justice and equality. He spoke of his hope for an America where what happened to him could never happen again. In his own unassuming way, he became a powerful voice in the burgeoning civil rights movement, his presence a living, breathing indictment of the system. When he stood before a crowd, no one could deny the reality of the violence that underpinned Jim Crow. He was the evidence. His case became a rallying cry that united Black America and its white allies in a way that few things had before. Prominent figures from all walks of life stepped up to support him. The boxer Joe Louis, a national hero, organized a benefit concert for Woodard at Louis-owned Stadium in New York, raising thousands of dollars. Musicians like Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, and Billie Holiday performed, lending their star power to his cause. Woody Guthrie, the legendary folk singer, wrote and performed a protest song called The Blinding of Isaac Woodard, its haunting lyrics telling the story to a different audience, embedding it in the cultural memory of the American folk tradition. The story resonated so deeply because it was so undeniably clear. Woodard was the perfect symbol. He was not a political radical or a criminal. He was a patriot. He had worn the uniform, fought the war, and asked for nothing more than the basic dignity afforded to any human being. The fact that his service, his uniform, and his medals had offered him zero protection from the brutal racism of his own country was a truth that was impossible to spin or explain away. It revealed the lie at the heart of the American promise. His life after the initial wave of publicity was a quiet one. He and his family settled in the Bronx. He learned to navigate his world without sight, to read Braille, to live with a degree of independence. He bought a building, managed it, and became a respected member of his community. He was a father and a grandfather. He lived for another 46 years after the attack, a long life filled with the ordinary joys and struggles of family and community. But the darkness was a constant companion. The physical and psychological scars of that night in Batesburg never fully healed. He was a living monument to the cost of hatred, a man who had to carry the burden of being a symbol for the rest of his days. In a strange and poignant twist of fate, the story of Isaac Woodard would have one final profound impact, this time on the very judge who had presided over the acquittal of his attacker. Judge J. Waddies Waring, the man from the Charleston aristocracy who had so callously dismissed the case, was deeply shaken by the experience. The national and international condemnation that followed the trial and the undeniable injustice of the verdict he had enabled sparked a crisis of conscience. He began a long and difficult journey of self-reflection, a process that would lead him to completely repudiate the white supremacist ideology he had grown up with. In the years that followed, Judge Waring became one of the most unlikely and powerful champions of civil rights in the entire South. From his federal bench, he began issuing a series of landmark rulings that chipped away at the foundations of segregation. He ordered equal pay for black and white school teachers. He outlawed the white primary, a key tool used to disenfranchise black voters. His decisions made him a pariah in his own community. He was ostracized by his friends, received constant death threats, and had crosses burned on his lawn. But he never wavered. His transformation culminated in 1951, when he was part of a 3-judge panel that heard a school desegregation case called Briggs versus Elliott. While the other 2 judges voted to uphold segregation, Judge Waring wrote a blistering, revolutionary, dissenting opinion, arguing that segregation was, by its very nature, a violation of the 14th Amendment. His dissent became the legal and moral blueprint for the NAACP's arguments in the case that would change everything, Brown v. Board of Education. The Supreme Court, when it finally outlawed school segregation in 1954, was essentially affirming the logic that Judge Waring had laid out. It is a stunning historical fact that the judge whose inaction had symbolized the failure of justice for Isaac Woodard became, because of that failure, a key architect of the legal downfall of segregation. The arc of the moral universe, it seems, is indeed long, but it does, in its own mysterious way, bend toward justice. Isaac Woodard, in his blindness, had not only opened the eyes of a president, he had opened the eyes of a judge, and in doing so, had set in motion a legal revolution. The story of Isaac Woodard is not just a chapter in the history of the civil rights movement. It is one of its foundational texts. His blinding was not the first act of racial violence against a veteran, nor was it the last, but the unique combination of his unimpeachable status as a hero, the sheer barbarity of the crime, and the national platform provided by figures like Orson Welles and President Truman transformed his personal tragedy into a national catalyst. His story became a point of no return for America. After Woodard, the nation could no longer pretend it did not know the true face of Jim Crow. His case served as a brutal but necessary education for a generation of activists and ordinary citizens. For many white Americans, particularly in the North, the realities of Southern racism were a distant, abstract concept. The story of Isaac Woodard made it terrifyingly concrete. It was not about separate water fountains or being forced to sit at the back of a bus. It was about a man having his eyes gouged out for asking to use a bathroom. The visceral horror of the act broke through the layers of complacency and denial. It forced people to confront the fact that segregation was not a benign social arrangement. It was a system of violent terrorism enforced by men with badges and nightsticks. This awakening, particularly among white liberals, was crucial in building the broad coalition of support that the civil rights movement would need to succeed in the decades to come. For Black America, the story was both a source of profound trauma and a powerful call to action. The acquittal of Linwood Shull confirmed their deepest fears, that the system was irredeemably rigged, that there was no justice to be found in a white man's court. But it also ignited a new and fiercer determination. The outrage over Woodard's case helped to swell the membership and the coffers of the NAACP, turning it into a more powerful and well-funded organization, ready for the long legal battles ahead. It galvanized Black veterans across the country, men who had just returned from fighting a war for global freedom, only to find themselves treated as enemies in their own hometowns. They were organized, disciplined, and unwilling to accept the status quo. The Woodard case was a declaration of war against them, and they were ready to fight back, not with guns, but with activism, with protests, and with the relentless demand for the rights they had earned. The direct line from Isaac Woodard to the desegregation of the military is perhaps his most tangible and monumental legacy. Executive Order 9981 was not just about changing the armed forces. It was the first major crack in the wall of federal segregation since Reconstruction. The military, as the nation's largest employer and a powerful symbol of American life, became a laboratory for integration. The process was slow, difficult, and met with resistance at every turn. But it was a start. The integrated military that fought in Korea and Vietnam, while far from perfect, was a direct result of the process Truman set in motion. And that process was set in motion by the story of Isaac Woodard. He had lost his sight, but he had given the nation a new vision of what its military, and by extension, what the country itself could be. His legacy also lives on in the very fabric of our civil rights laws. The failure of the federal government to secure a conviction against Linwood Shull, despite the clear evidence, highlighted the weakness of existing federal civil rights statutes. It demonstrated that as long as all white Southern juries were allowed to nullify federal law through racist verdicts, justice would be impossible. This realization fueled the long legal and legislative push for stronger federal protections, a push that would eventually lead to the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws, which gave the federal government the power to prosecute civil rights violations and oversee elections, were a direct answer to the travesty of justice that had occurred in that South Carolina courtroom in 1946. Isaac Woodard's case was one of the key pieces of evidence used to argue for their necessity, And yet, despite this monumental impact, his name has largely faded from the popular consciousness. We remember Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. We remember the March on Washington. We remember Brown versus Board of Education. But Isaac Woodard, the man whose story was a critical catalyst for so much of what followed, is often a footnote, if he is mentioned at all. This forgetting is, in itself, a tragedy. It speaks to our collective desire for simpler, less brutal narratives. We prefer stories of nonviolent protest and legal victories. The raw, physical horror of what happened to Isaac Woodard is a difficult and uncomfortable truth. It reminds us that the civil rights movement was not just a series of peaceful marches. It was a war fought against a system of violent terrorism, and there were casualties. Isaac Woodard was one of its most prominent casualties. To remember him is to remember the true cost of Jim Crow. It is to understand that the fight for civil rights was not just a political struggle. It was a physical one, fought by people who risked their lives and their bodies every single day. His story is a necessary antidote to the sanitized, feel-good versions of history that are so often taught. It reminds us that progress is not a gentle upward slope. It is a brutal, bloody, and often heartbreaking struggle. In the end, Isaac Woodard's life is a story of profound and painful irony. He went to war to fight for freedom and lost his own in the most horrific way imaginable. He wore the uniform of a hero and was treated like an animal. A court of law, meant to be a symbol of justice, became the final instrument of his humiliation. And yet, through it all, his tragedy became a triumph for the cause of freedom. The darkness he was plunged into forced a nation to open its eyes. The injustice he suffered became the catalyst for one of the most important steps toward justice in the 20th century. He was a quiet man who never asked to be a hero, who never sought to be a symbol. He just wanted to go home. But in his brutal, painful journey, he ended up leading an entire nation a little closer to its own ideals. He paid a price that no human being should ever have to pay, but his sacrifice was not in vain. It echoed in the halls of the White House. It shaped the laws of the land, and it helped to bend the arc of the moral universe, just a little bit, toward justice. We began this story with a soldier on a bus, a man who had survived a world war and was on his way home to a life of peace. That peace was stolen from him in a few moments of unimaginable brutality. Isaac Woodard was plunged into a darkness that would last for the rest of his life. But the story of what happened to him, once it escaped the silence of that South Carolina jail, became a blinding flash of light, illuminating the hypocrisy and systemic cruelty of a nation. His tragedy was not an end. It was a beginning. It was the spark that ignited a firestorm. So what is the final lesson we must take from the life of Sergeant Isaac Woodard? It is a story that operates on two profound levels. On one level, it is a stark and brutal reminder of the reality of American history. It forces us to look away from the comforting myths and confront the raw, violent truth of racial oppression. It is a story that is hard to hear, and even harder to accept. But we must. To forget Isaac Woodard is to willfully blind ourselves to the true nature of the struggle for civil rights. It is to pretend that progress was a gentle evolution, when in fact it was a brutal, bloody war fought by individuals who paid an incredible price. His story is a permanent scar on the American conscience, a reminder of the depths of hatred that have shaped the nation, and the immense courage it took to confront it. But on another, deeper level, his story is one of profound, almost unbelievable, transformative power. It is a testament to the fact that even the most horrific act of injustice can, against all odds, become a catalyst for profound good. Isaac Woodard did not choose to be a martyr. He was a victim, but his suffering, once it was amplified by the voices of the righteous, took on a power of its own. It became a moral weapon that could not be deflected. It reached the conscience of a president and shifted the gears of history. His story is the ultimate proof that one life, one story, one act of injustice made public can change the world. It is a lesson in the incredible, unpredictable power of a single narrative to shape the destiny of millions. His life forces us to ask a difficult question. What is our responsibility when we are confronted with a story like this? It is easy to feel a sense of distant historical sadness. It is harder to recognize that the forces that blinded Isaac Woodard, systemic racism, police brutality, and a justice system that too often protects the powerful, have not vanished. They have merely changed their form. The fight that Isaac Woodard's tragedy helped to ignite is not over. The work is not done. His story is a call to action. It is a demand that we keep our own eyes open. It is a challenge to refuse to be silent in the face of injustice, no matter how small or how distant it may seem. The NAACP and Orson Welles took the story of one man and made it the story of a nation. They understood that silence is the oxygen that injustice needs to breathe. By speaking out, by refusing to let the story die, they choked that oxygen supply. They proved that our voices, when raised together, have the power to hold even the highest offices accountable. The next time you see a uniform, remember Isaac Woodard. Remember that the respect it is meant to command is a promise that was brutally broken for him and for countless others. Remember that his service and his sacrifice were not invalidated by the hatred he faced, but were in fact magnified by it. He fought for a country that did not yet deserve him, embodying an ideal of patriotism that was far more profound than that of the men who attacked him. Isaac Woodard lived the rest of his life in quiet dignity, but the nation he changed would never be quiet again. The desegregation of the military was the first domino to fall in the federal government's assault on Jim Crow. It was followed by Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. All of these victories stand on the shoulders of forgotten battles, on the pain of unsung heroes. Isaac Woodard is one of the most important of those heroes. He was a man who lost his sight, but gave a nation its vision. A man whose personal darkness illuminated a national truth. A man who simply wanted to go home, and in his journey ended up forcing an entire country to finally begin the long, painful journey home to its own founding principles. To remember Isaac Woodard is not just to remember a tragedy. It is to remember the power of a single story to bend the arc of history. It is to accept our own responsibility to bear witness, to speak truth to power, and to continue the fight for a nation that is finally worthy of the sacrifices made in its name. The darkness they forced upon him did not end his story. It made him a beacon. And that light, born of unimaginable pain, has never gone out.